It was supposed to be a simple job, one I'd done dozens of times before. Routine water heater inspection at a modest home tucked away on a quiet street in a small town. But nothing about that afternoon turned out to be simple. As I pulled up the driveway, I noticed the garden was blooming wildly, like the place was holding on to some kind of secret beauty despite the signs of age scattered across the house's weathered facade. The woman who greeted me, Marion, was somewhere in her early 50s. And right from the start, there was something different about her, something both vulnerable and strong all at once. I had no idea that by the time I left, a question she quietly asked would echo in my mind far longer than any job I'd done before. Do you think I'm still beautiful at 53? That question hung in the air like a fragile thread, pulling me into a story far richer than a broken water heater or a faulty valve. As a handyman, I'm used to fixing things, pipes, doors, fences, but sometimes the repairs go deeper, touching parts of people's lives that aren't visible on any blueprint. Marion's home wasn't just a house needing maintenance. It was a place full of memories, hopes, and wounds, slowly healing. What started as a simple job would stretch over days, maybe even weeks, as I found myself stepping into a world where beauty, aging, and loneliness intertwined in ways I hadn't expected. When I arrived, Marion was dressed casually, her silver-streaked hair pulled back loosely, eyes sharp but carrying a subtle sadness. The water heater was old, sputtering and leaking, a reflection of the years she'd lived here alone after her children moved out and her husband left long ago. She welcomed me with a warm but reserved smile. And as I got to work, she hovered nearby, offering tea and snippets of conversation. The kind you don't fully pay attention to at first, but that gradually start to reveal someone's story. I noticed the photographs on the walls, pictures of a younger Marion laughing with friends, her children playing in the yard, moments frozen in happier times. It was clear she held on to those memories tightly, maybe even more than she wanted. To admit, over the course of that first visit, I fixed what I could of the heater and promised to come back with parts that weren't immediately available. Marion seemed hesitant, but invited me to stay a bit longer, and that's when the conversation turned personal. Without warning, she asked, "Do you think I'm still beautiful at 53? The question caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting a woman to ask something so raw, so vulnerable. I knew instantly it wasn't about vanity. It was about something much deeper. A plea for reassurance in a life where beauty and worth seemed to be fading away. That moment changed everything. From then on, my visits weren't just about plumbing or repairs. They became small windows into Marion's life, her doubts, her regrets, and her quiet hopes. I learned about her struggles with loneliness after her divorce, the way she felt invisible to the world outside her door, and the ways she clung to the idea that she might still matter, still be seen. Shared pieces of my own story why I took this job, how I'd come to appreciate the small connections with people I met. Our conversations unfolded slowly, naturally, like the water heater warming up after a long chill. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. As days turned into weeks, I returned regularly, fixing more than just the water heater, just in door hinges, patching walls, even helping in the garden. Each visit peeled back another layer of Marion's guarded heart. She started to laugh, more, her eyes brightening with moments of genuine joy. We talked about everything from her favorite books to the music that used to fill the house when her children were young. It was in those moments I saw her beauty, not just the surface kind, but the resilience and grace that comes from surviving hardship. One afternoon, as I was tightening a pipe under the sink, Marion brought up her past love stories. She spoke softly about the man she once thought she'd spend forever with, and the loneliness that followed their parting. She confessed how hard it was to look in the mirror and recognize the woman staring back, a woman who carried years of pain but still longed to be loved. I told her honestly that beauty isn't measured by age or youth, but by the courage to keep going, to keep loving and living even when the world seems to have forgotten you. Those words seemed to settle in her mind like a seed taking root. Over time, Marion began to change, not overnight, but gradually. She started hosting small dinners for friends, planting new flowers in her garden, and even signing up for a dance class she'd always wanted to try. She asked me to bring a friend over once, a woman I knew from my neighborhood, and I could see the flicker of excitement behind her hesitant smile. Yet, despite the growing warmth, there were still moments of doubt. One evening after a long day of work, Marian asked me again, almost shyly this time, "Do you really think I'm still beautiful?" I paused, knowing that my answer carried more weight than just words. I told her that beauty is a light you carry inside, a reflection of your spirit and kindness, and that, at 53, she shone brighter than ever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the visits continued, the bond between us deepened. Not into romance, but something equally profound, a companionship built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. Marian taught me that beauty was never about looking perfect, but about embracing your true self, scars and all. And I learned that sometimes fixing a broken water heater can lead to mending broken hearts. Towards the end of this chapter of our lives, Marian invited me to join her for a walk through the neighborhood park. The air was crisp, the leaves turning, shades of amber and gold. As we walked, she looked over at me with a quiet smile and said, "Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me." I smiled back, realizing that the beauty she sought had never been something to prove to the world. It had always been there, quietly shining beneath the surface. After that first day, the visits became part of my routine, though each one carried a feeling that went beyond just fixing household issues. Marian's house was more than a physical space needing repairs. It was a home filled with stories, moments frozen in time, and an unspoken loneliness that clung to the walls. I found myself looking forward to the next appointment, not just for the work, but for the chance to sit in her kitchen, sipping tea, and listening to her quietly share parts of herself. The water heater, once the star of the day, faded into the background as our conversations took center stage. She would sometimes watch me fix things with a distant look, like she was weighing the small changes I made against the larger repairs she wished she could make in her own life. Marian's question about her beauty kept echoing in my mind long after I left her house. I realized it wasn't a one-time thing, but a thread that ran through all our interactions. She wasn't asking just about her reflection or how others might see her. She was asking if she still mattered, if the years hadn't diminished her worth. There was a quiet desperation wrapped in those words, a need to be seen and valued beyond appearances. It made me more aware of how often we all hide our insecurities beneath smiles and casual greetings, and how important it is to recognize the humanity in everyone we meet. As I fixed leaking faucets and replaced old light bulbs, I also found myself mending a little piece of that loneliness. Simply by being there and listening, each visit revealed more layers of Marian's life. I learned about her former career as a school teacher, her love for poetry, and how she had taken pride in raising her children in that very house. Her voice carried the weight of years spent caring for others, often putting their needs before her own. She confided how the divorce had left her feeling unmoored, like she'd lost not just a partner, but a part of herself. The silence that followed those confessions was never uncomfortable. It was filled with the unspoken understanding that sometimes just being present was enough. I shared stories of my own past, to how I ended up as a handyman after drifting through different jobs, and how I found purpose in the simple acts of helping people keep their homes running. It was in those moments that the distance between us shrank, placed by a fragile trust. I noticed how Marian's posture changed over time, how the lines around her eyes softened when she laughed, and how she began to carry herself with a bit more confidence. She would tell me about the books she was reading and the music she loved, and occasionally she'd surprise me by asking my opinion on things that seemed small but mattered deeply, like whether a faded photograph should be kept or thrown away, or if a cracked teacup could still hold meaning. It was in these seemingly trivial decisions that I saw her grappling with the passage of time and the idea of what to hold on to and what to let go. Our conversations became a dance of memories and hopes, the past and future blending in the warmth of the present. One afternoon, while replacing a broken faucet handle. Marion shared a story from her Youth Summer Festival where she had danced until dawn under strings of twinkling lights. Her eyes sparkled as she recalled the freedom and joy of those nights, a stark contrast to the quiet routine that had settled over her life. I realized then how much of her spirit still burned bright beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to be rekindled. She admitted she sometimes felt invisible, as if the world had moved on without her, leaving her behind in a quiet corner. I told her that invisibility was a trick of perspective, and that sometimes it takes someone else's eyes to remind us of our own light. The more time I spent with Marion, the more I understood that her question about beauty was less about looks and more about identity. She was trying to find herself again in a world that often measures worth by youth and appearance. It was a struggle familiar to many, but deeply personal in her case. I admired her courage to ask that question openly, and it made me reflect on how often people hide their true feelings behind humor or silence. It reminded me that sometimes the simplest jobs can lead to the most meaningful connections, how a cracked pipe might bring two people together in unexpected ways as the weeks went on. Marion's home began to feel less like a place weighed down by memories and more like a space ready for new stories. She started to invite friends over again, sharing meals and laughter in the same kitchen where we had spent hours talking. The garden, once wild and unkempt, was slowly tamed with new flowers and fresh soil, a visible sign of renewal. I found myself wanting to do more than just fix things. I wanted to help her rebuild not just her home but her confidence and joy. Our conversations took on a hopeful tone, with plans for small adventures like visiting the local art gallery or trying out a cooking class. It was clear that Marion was beginning to see herself not as someone defined by the past, but as a woman ready to embrace whatever came next. One evening, as I was packing up my tools, Marion paused and looked at me thoughtfully. She asked if I thought it was silly for her to want to start over at 53, to take chances and put herself out there again. I told her it was never silly to chase happiness, no matter your age, and that bravery looks different for everyone. It can be in big leaps or small steps, but it's always worth it. She smiled then, a genuine smile that lit up her face and left no doubt in my mind that she was ready for change. Our bond wasn't a whirlwind. Romance was something quieter, but just as profound. It was about two people recognizing each other's humanity and offering kindness in a world that often feels indifferent. I wasn't there to fix Marion's life, just her water heater and a few other things around the house. But somehow, our connection made both of us feel less alone. It was a reminder that beauty isn't a fleeting thing tied to youth or looks, it's the warmth we share. It's the strength to face another day, and the courage to ask the hard questions. This story isn't just about a broken water heater or a simple handyman's visit. It's about the invisible repairs we all need, repairing our sense of self, finding connection in unexpected places, and realizing that beauty and worth don't fade with age. Marion taught me that sometimes the most important fixes are the ones that happen inside, where no tool can reach, but the heart can heal. It was around the fourth or fifth visit when I noticed something different in the way. Marion opened the door. There was still the familiar politeness, the same warm expression. But now it came with a kind of ease, as if my presence no longer felt like a service call, but rather a welcomed routine. She no longer hesitated when offering coffee or tea, and she didn't hover near the door like someone waiting for a stranger to leave. Instead, she pulled a second chair over to the kitchen counter, placed it just far enough so I'd know I was welcome to sit, and returned to what she was doing. That morning, she was reorganizing her spice rack, muttering to herself about expiration. Dates and jars with missing labels. I remember watching her from the side, noticing the gentleness in her movements, the way she hummed while working, and how she didn't try to fill the silence with unnecessary chatter. It was in that quiet comfort that I began to understand how much healing was taking place in the space between what was said and what was simply shared. As I bent down to check the new valve I'd installed, I listened as Marion recounted a story about her daughter, who had recently moved to another city for work. Her voice was proud but laced with longing. She hadn't seen her daughter in almost a year, And the way she described their phone calls, brief, polite, full of updates but lacking intimacy, revealed a deeper ache. I could tell she missed being needed, missed the kind of presence that fills a house with chaos and laughter and the occasional slammed door. Her children had grown, built their own lives, and left her behind with a calendar that was more empty than full. I didn't interrupt, just tightened the valve and let her speak, because sometimes being heard is all a person really needs. She told me about the holidays, how she used to cook for 12 people, how the sound of chairs scraping the floor and forks clinking against plates was her favorite kind of music. Now the holidays came and went with little fanfare, sometimes just a small meal and a call that came hours late. She laughed lightly, saying she'd gotten used to the quiet, but her eyes betrayed the truth. There was a loneliness there that wasn't bitter or angry, it was just tired. The kind of loneliness that settles into the bones and makes even bright days feel dim. I felt an urge to do more than just listen. I wanted to remind her that even though her world had changed, it hadn't ended. After I packed up my tools, I lingered at the doorway. It felt wrong to just walk out like it was any other day. So I asked her if she wanted help moving the old boxes in her garage, ones she'd mentioned needing to sort through, but never found the time or motivation to tackle. Her eyes lit up in that moment, not because of the task itself, but because someone had offered to stay, to help with something that had no urgency or technical skill. She agreed, and we spent the next hour shifting boxes, laughing over the dust, and uncovering pieces of her past. There were photo albums with yellowed pages, letters from friends long out of touch, and even a pair of tap shoes she confessed she'd worn once at a local dance recital. She blushed, telling me about it, brushing it off as a silly memory, but I saw the sparkle in her eyes, the way recalling it made her feel young again, if only for a moment. The garage became another extension of our conversation. It was where nostalgia mixed with reflection, where Marion wasn't just a homeowner needing repairs, but a woman revisiting the chapters of her life she hadn't opened in years. She handed me a framed picture of herself in her 20s, standing beside her college friends at the beach. Her hair was long and sun-kissed, her smile wide and carefree. She looked at it for a long time before setting it down and softly saying, "Sometimes I miss being her." I could have told her she still was, that the same light lived in her now, just tempered by experience and years, but I didn't. I knew that words, no matter how kind, wouldn't erase the ache. So I stayed quiet and just nodded, letting her know I understood. We didn't talk about beauty again directly for a while, but I could feel the question hovering in the air. It was there in the way she paused before looking in the mirror, in the way she smoothed down her blouse before opening the door, in the way she scanned my face when she asked my opinion on something, and I wasn't immune either. I found myself more thoughtful about my own reflection, about the gray at my temples and the calluses on my hands. There was something about Marion that made me more aware of time, not in a fearful way, but in a way that made me want to use it better. To be present, to notice more, to value the ordinary moments before they passed me by, that awareness spilled into everything. The next time I came over, I brought her a small bag of pastries from a bakery I liked in town. Nothing fancy, just a gesture. She looked surprised and touched, and we ate them together on her front porch while the sun dipped low behind the trees. She asked about my week, and I told her about a job that went sideways and a customer who had yelled at me for something that wasn't my fault. She didn't offer advice. She just listened, and in doing so gave me the same comfort I'd tried to give her. We were becoming fixtures in each other's days, and I didn't mind it one bit. Later that evening, as I was getting ready to leave, Marion said something that stayed with me. She said, "You make me feel like I still have a place in the world." It wasn't dramatic or emotional, just a simple, honest statement, but it hit me harder than any compliment ever could. I realized then that what we were building wasn't just a friendship or a support system. It was a quiet kind of love, not romantic, not defined, but deeply human. The kind of love that sees someone exactly as they are and chooses to stay anyway. As I drove home that night, the radio playing softly, I thought about how easy it is to overlook people like Marion. Women who've lived full lives, raised children, sacrificed pieces of themselves for others, only to find the world suddenly silent around them. I thought about how many people walk through life never feeling truly seen, and I promised myself I wouldn't let Marion be one of them. Oh, not while I was around. The following week, when I returned to Marion's house, I noticed something subtle had shifted. The curtains were pulled back, letting in more light than usual. A fresh pot of coffee was brewing, and a faint scent of lavender floated through. The air from a candle flickering in the corner of the living room? The air didn't carry that quiet heaviness it used. It felt more lived in, more awake. She greeted me with a soft smile, wearing a loose sweater and jeans that suited her in a way that made her seem both casual and quietly graceful. There was no rush in her voice, no nervous chatter, just a calm presence that made me slow down and match her pace. For the first time, she invited me to sit before I even touched my tools, as if the visit wasn't just about work anymore. And I suppose it wasn't. I'd returned to adjust the thermostat on the water heater and check for a strange rattling sound Marion had heard the night before. As I stepped into the laundry area where the heater was tucked away, I could hear her humming in the background, not loudly, but with the kind of ease that suggested she hadn't felt like doing that in a long time. That hum said more than any story she could tell. It was healing in motion, slow but unmistakable. Ironically, had become a symbol in my mind for everything about Marion's life. An aging appliance that had quietly kept things running until one day it couldn't anymore. But once it was opened up, cleaned out, and shown a little care, it started working again. Not perfectly, not like it did in its first years, but good enough to keep going. That felt familiar as I worked. I could hear Marion on the phone in the next room. She was talking to her sister, arranging a weekend lunch, and I smiled to myself. At how natural it sounded. When she hung up, she stepped into the room and leaned against the doorframe. She told me she'd decided to reach out to a few people she hadn't spoken to in a while. Old friends, former coworkers, even an old neighbor she'd had a falling out with years ago. She wasn't sure why exactly. Maybe something about our talks had nudged her to reconnect, to stop letting time do all the talking. I told her it was a good idea, even if it felt uncomfortable at first. The truth was, we all wait too long sometimes to say things we should have said years ago. After the heater check was done, she asked me to stay for lunch. She'd made a simple vegetable soup, warm and fragrant, and set the table with 2 bowls, like she'd planned to have company. We sat at her dining table, a space I imagined had once hosted holiday feasts, birthday cakes, maybe even arguments over homework and curfews. Now, it was just the 2 of us, eating quietly, comfortably, like we'd done this before, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She told me about her love of cooking and how she used to experiment with recipes. When the kids were younger, she laughed as she described some of her worst kitchen disasters, and the one time she tried to make homemade sushi and ended up with a rice-covered cat and a ruined cutting board. The more she talked, the more animated she became, her hands gesturing with excitement, her eyes glowing with energy I hadn't seen during those first few visits. There was something deeply beautiful about the way she carried those memories. It's not clinging to them in sadness, but offering them as a gift, as if saying, "This was my life. It mattered. I mattered." And she did. In every story, in every laugh, in every pause where the past touched the present, Marion became more than the woman with the broken water heater. She became someone whose life had been rich with love, loss, humor, and resilience. After lunch, moved to the living room, where she showed me a stack of books she had pulled from the attic. Some were classics, others were worn paperbacks with dog-eared pages and notes scribbled in the margins. She asked if I liked to read, and I admitted I did, though I rarely made the time for it. She handed me one of her favorites, a novel about a woman who travels alone after her husband's death, and slowly finds her way back to herself. Marion said she always related to the character even before her own marriage ended. I took the book without hesitation. It felt like more than a loan. It felt like trust. We talked for hours that day about things that didn't seem to matter. On the surface, favorite movies, childhood dreams, irrational fears, but under the weight of time and experience, those small things carried surprising depth. She told me she once dreamed of writing a children's book that she had a few rough drafts tucked away somewhere that she never showed anyone. I told her she should dig them out, that maybe they were better than she thought. She smiled a little. Shy? But I could tell the idea had stirred something in her. Maybe for the first time in years, she believed it was still possible to begin again. As I got ready to leave, Marion walked me to the door, like she always did, but this time she paused. She looked at me not just with gratitude, but with that same searching expression she had the first day. She asked if I thought she was still beautiful. This time, though, she didn't ask the question out loud. She didn't need to. It was there in the way she stood, in the way she looked at me, waiting for something she couldn't quite name. I think she saw the answer in my eyes before I could speak, because I wasn't looking at a woman struggling to reclaim her beauty anymore. I was looking at a woman who had finally begun to see it for herself. As I drove away, I kept thinking about the small moments we shared that day. How time spent listening, sharing meals, swapping stories, those things could transform the texture of a life. I wasn't trying to change Marion's world, and she wasn't trying to change mine. But somehow, simply by being real with each other, we were both slowly becoming something fuller. There was no grand transformation, no sweeping declaration. Just a people learning to be seen and learning to see each other in return. It was a few days after that quiet afternoon when Marion sent me a message, just a short text, asking if I could come by to check on a strange noise coming from the back door. The tone was casual, polite, but I could sense she wasn't just talking about a creak in the hinges. There was something in the way she worded it that made me think she wanted company more than she wanted repairs. I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed the invitation. When I arrived, the house felt even warmer than usual, as if the weather itself had settled differently around her space. The curtains were open again, the candle was burning, and this time, soft music played faintly in the background, an old jazz tune. The kind you don't hear much anymore, but that lingers long after it's gone. She greeted me at the door with a smile that had lost the hesitation it used to carry. Her hair was pulled back in a loose twist, and there was a brightness in her. Eyes that seemed less about how she looked and more about how she felt. She led me to the door in question, which did squeak faintly when opened, but I could have fixed it in a few minutes if I had rushed. Instead, I took my time. I checked the hinges, tightened the screws slowly, and let her keep talking while I worked. She told me about a neighbor who had stopped by the day before with leftover muffins, and how they'd sat on the porch talking for over an hour, something she hadn't done with anyone in years. She laughed as she said it felt like life was. Knocking again, asking politely to come in. When I finished with the door, she invited me to sit for a bit. There was a small bench near her garden, facing a row of stubborn rose bushes that were just beginning to bloom again. We sat there in the shade, sipping iced tea and listening to the faint hum of bees drifting lazily from one flower to the next. She asked me how I spent my weekends, and I told her about the odd jobs that sometimes filled up my Saturdays, but also about the quiet mornings I spent hiking or reading or just sitting in a local coffee shop, watching people come and go. Said she used to do that two-people watch from her car in the grocery store lot or from a bench at the park hand. How she'd create entire stories in her head about their lives. We both laughed at how similar that was to what we'd been doing with each other all along, learning through observation, slowly revealing the truth over time. As we sat in the stillness, she asked me something unexpected, if I thought people could really change. Not in the dramatic, movie-style transformation kind of way, but in the quiet, genuine sense of becoming someone new after years of being stuck. I told her I thought people don't really change so much as they remember who they were before they forgot. Life has a way of burying us under obligations and routines and heartbreak. But sometimes, when the weight shifts just right, a part of us peeks through again. I said I'd seen it happen, not just with others, but in myself too. She didn't say much in response, just nodded and looked toward the rose bushes like she was searching for something beyond the blooms later. Inside the house, she showed me her old photo albums. Not the digital kind, but the thick, leather-bound books with plastic sleeves and handwritten notes in the corners. We sat on the floor, flipping through the pages as she told me stories behind the images: family vacations, birthday parties, Lazy Sunday mornings and matching pajamas with her kids. There were pictures of her younger self, full of life and wide-eyed energy. And I could see the subtle wince she gave each time she paused on a particularly youthful image. It wasn't vanity. It was grief. A small mourning for a time when things felt more certain, more open. I could see she was grappling with that old, familiar fear that maybe the best parts of her life had already happened. That's when I told her something I hadn't planned. 2. I told her about my mother, how she'd passed away when I was just a teenager, and how watching her try to rediscover herself after her divorce had shaped my understanding of strength. My mother had been just a few years older than Marion. When she started over, moving to a new town with nothing but 2 suitcases and a quiet determination to rebuild her life. I told Marion how I watched her learn to laugh again, to dance in the kitchen with no music, to start dating not because she needed someone, but because she'd finally remembered she deserved joy. Marion listened intently, her fingers resting on a faded photo of her own, and I could tell the story had landed somewhere deep as the afternoon sun dipped lower. Casting golden light through the window, Marion asked me a question that surprised me even more than the one about beauty. She asked if I thought she was selfish for wanting more. Not just more time or more love, but more life, more experiences, more nights filled with laughter, more days with purpose. I looked at her, at the woman who had quietly reclaimed pieces of herself in front of my eyes, and I told her it wasn't selfish at all, it was brave. Most people settle for less because they're afraid to hope for more. But Marion wasn't settling anymore. She was, in her own way, beginning again. And somewhere, in the quiet of that moment, I realized I was beginning again too. Without planning it, without expecting it, I had started to care deeply for her. Not in the way stories rush into romance, but in the steady, grounding way that makes you want to show up every day just to see someone smile. I didn't know what would come of it. I didn't need to know. What mattered was that she felt seen, that she was no longer invisible, and that somehow, in her journey back to herself, she had helped me rediscover something in myself too. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that neither of us had planned, but both had come to rely on. I'd show up under the pretense of checking a minor issue: loose wiring in the fuse box, a misaligned cabinet door, a persistent squeak in the bedroom window, but those repairs took a back seat to the time we spent just being there. Marion had stopped trying to explain why she called me over so often, and I'd stopped pretending like I needed a reason to stay longer than necessary. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a shared silence that said, I like having you here, and truthfully, I liked being there more than anywhere else. It wasn't just the warmth of her home or the way the afternoon light danced on her kitchen tiles. It was Marion herself.
Ow.
The way she spoke about life in fragments, memories triggered by the smell of cinnamon, the sound of an old tune, the feel of cold tile beneath her feet. She was not a woman clinging to her past, but rather someone gently sifting through it, deciding which parts to carry forward. One morning she asked if I wanted to join her for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool and crisp, the kind that made you breathe a little deeper. She wore a light jacket and a faded baseball cap that made her look younger than usual. We strolled without a set path, occasionally stopping so she could point out a tree she'd always loved or a house that used to belong to a friend who'd moved away. She had this quiet fondness for the ordinary, and I found myself watching her more than the scenery. There was something grounding in the way she moved through the world, not rushing toward anything, just noticing, appreciating. It made me want to slow down too. As we rounded a bend, we came across a small park. Just a bench, a few trees, and a cracked path leading toward a dried-up fountain. She smiled at the sight of it and told me this was where she used to bring her kids after school. They'd run up and down that path, she said, pointing. While I sat on that bench and pretended to read, but really just watched them, she paused, and I could see the memory playing in her mind, vivid and bittersweet. Time plays tricks, she added quietly. One day they're clinging to your hand, and the next, they're too busy to call. I didn't respond. Some things don't need a reply. So I sat beside her on that old bench, letting the silence settle comfortably between us. We talked for over an hour that day, about aging, about regret, about the strange comfort of routine. She admitted she'd spent years convincing herself that needing someone was a weakness, that being self-sufficient meant never asking for help. But lately, she said, she'd begun to see how strength sometimes looks like reaching out, not standing alone. I told her I admired her willingness to open up, to let me in. She smiled at me then, not with flirtation or expectation, but with a kind of gratitude that felt like a weight being set down. Back at her house, she offered me a slice of banana bread she'd baked the night before. It was warm and soft. We ate it at the counter while she read aloud the first few pages of that children's book she'd mentioned. The one she wrote years ago and had tucked away in a dusty drawer. Her voice shook a little at first, but as she continued, her confidence returned. The story was gentle and imaginative, about a young bird learning to fly after watching all its friends take off without it. The message was subtle but clear. It's never too late to take flight. When she finished, she looked up, waiting for my reaction. I told her honestly that it was beautiful and that she should finish it. She blushed but nodded, saying maybe she would. In the days that followed, we started sharing more of ourselves, trading small pieces like stones collected from different beaches. She told me about her college years, how she used to paint late into the night in a shared studio apartment. She showed me a few of her old canvases, abstract shapes and colors that mirrored emotions she couldn't always put into words. I told her about my first job out of high school, working under a gruff old electrician who taught me how to read people better than I read schematics. We didn't talk about us not in direct terms, but the space between our stories grew shorter, like two paths slowly curving toward the same point. One afternoon, fixing a jammed sliding door, I heard her humming again, this time from upstairs. Her voice was clear, almost melodic, and it floated down the hallway like a breeze. I stood still for a moment, just listening. It wasn't just the sound that moved me. It was the fact that she felt safe enough to sing with me there. That kind of ease doesn't happen often. It's earned. And in that moment, I realized something else. I hadn't just become part of her comfort. She had become part of mine. Looking forward to these visits not just for her company, but because she reminded me of something I hadn't felt in years, the simple joy of being known. The next time I came over, she had rearranged the living room furniture. Nothing drastic, just a new angle to the couch, a different position for the reading lamp. But it changed the whole feel of the space. I joked that she was starting over again, and she laughed, saying sometimes you just need a fresh perspective. She invited me to stay for dinner, and I did. We ate stir-fry on the porch while the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. The conversation was light but meaningful, small updates, little anecdotes, a shared comfort. In silence, after dinner, we stayed outside a while longer, the porch lights flickering on as the sky deepened to indigo. She leaned back in her chair, looking up at the stars, and asked if I ever thought about where I'd be 10 years from now. I told her I used to make plans, used to think I had everything mapped out, but now I just tried to make the next right decision. She nodded slowly, as if that made sense to her too. I think she said after a pause that the best things in life are the ones you never see coming. And I knew, without needing to say it, that we were both thinking the same thing. That night, as I drove home, I kept thinking about how quietly everything had changed. There had been no declarations, no grand confessions, just a slow, steady unfolding of two lives that had found comfort in each other's company. And maybe that was the kind of story worth telling, not one of whirlwind romance or dramatic twists, but of two people, both quietly broken in their own ways, helping each other remember how to live again. The next time I returned, it was under the guise of replacing a broken vent cover in the laundry room. But by then, we both knew that these visits weren't really about the small repairs anymore. They were an excuse, a socially acceptable reason to stay in each other's lives without forcing a conversation neither of us was fully ready to have. Still, there was a comfort in the routine of it. I knocked on the door, she answered with a smile that said more than words, and we went about our day as if this arrangement had always been part of the plan. I carried my toolbox inside and asked her what was new. She told me about a dream she had where she was driving down a coastal road with no destination. Just the wind in her hair and the radio playing a song she hadn't heard since she was a teenager. It sounded like freedom. I told her that maybe it was her mind's way of reminding her that it wasn't too late to chase that feeling again. She nodded but didn't say anything, just let the thought hang between us like a note. In a song that hadn't yet resolved, I replaced the vent cover in less than 15 minutes, but I stayed for hours. We ended up in her kitchen again, sipping on mint tea she had picked up from a little boutique store she'd started visiting. She was trying new things, little by little, different teas, different meals, even a watercolor class she'd signed up for at the community center. She told me she was nervous that she hadn't painted in years, but there was a flicker of excitement in her voice that I hadn't heard before. She showed me the cheap little art set she'd ordered online, brushes still in their packaging, paints unopened, canvas boards stacked on the counter like blank pages waiting for her to write again. I encouraged her, told her it didn't matter if she was rusty, that the act of creating was more important than the result. She thanked me, her eyes softening in that way they did when she was truly touched, and then she reached out and rested, her hand on mine just for a moment, just long enough for something to pass between us unspoken. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, she walked me to the door as usual. This time, though, there was a longer pause. She didn't open the door right away. Instead, she looked at me and said she'd been thinking a lot about something about what it meant to be seen. It's really seen, and how rare that was. She told me that for years, she'd felt invisible, not just to strangers, but to her family, to her friends, to the world. As if the moment she passed a certain age, people stopped looking at her like a woman with wants and needs and started seeing her only as a caretaker, a relic, a background character in someone else's life. But lately, she said, she'd begun to feel visible again, not because of a new haircut or makeup or clothes, but because I looked at her like she mattered, not as a project to fix, not as a client, but as a whole person. I didn't know what to say to that. I just nodded, overwhelmed by the honesty of her words, and told her the truth that she mattered to me too. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her voice replaying in my head over and over. You look at me like I matter. It was such a simple thing to say, and yet it carried the weight of everything she'd been holding in for years. I realized then just how lonely she must have been all this time. How hard it must have been to keep showing up for life when no one seemed to show up for her. And I wondered how many others were out there, living in that same quiet ache, waiting for someone to notice them. I knew I couldn't change the world for all of them, but maybe I could keep showing up for Marion. Maybe that was enough. The following weekend, she invited me to her first painting class. Not to attend, just to walk her there. She said she didn't want to show up alone, that having a familiar face nearby gave her courage. I agreed without hesitation. We met at her place, and she came out wearing a loose smock over her jeans, her hair tied back with a patterned scarf, and a spark in her eyes that made me smile instantly. We walked to the center together, and the whole time she talked about how nervous she was, but also how good it felt to be doing something new, something that was just for her. When we arrived, I waited outside, watching through the window as she took a deep breath and stepped into the studio. She looked around, nodded at the instructor, and then found her seat. When she looked up and saw me still outside, she smiled and waved. That wave said everything. It said thank you. It said I'm doing this. And most importantly, it said I'm not afraid anymore. After class, we walked back together, and she told me all about the other students, the exercises they did, the way the paint felt in her hands. She described the sensation like a rediscovery of something she didn't even realize she'd missed. She even laughed when she admitted her first painting looked like a toddler with attitude had made it. But she was proud of it. She said it was hers, imperfections and all. That was the start of something new. Every week after that, she kept going, and every week she told me about her progress, how the brush strokes started to feel more natural, how the colors blended better, how her hands stopped shaking when she dipped into the water jar. I started to see the changes in her even more clearly. She walked taller, smiled faster, and spoke with the confidence of someone who no longer questioned if her voice deserved to be heard. And one afternoon, after I helped her install a new shelf in her laundry room, she pulled me aside and showed me a small canvas she had tucked away. On it was a painting of two chairs on a porch, side by side, facing a sunset. It was simple, maybe even amateur in technique, but it stopped me in my tracks. She said it reminded her of us. How we sat out there so often, just talking sometimes, not even talking at all, and yet it always felt like the most important part of the day. I didn't know what to say, so I asked if I could keep it. She hesitated, then nodded and placed it in my hands like she was handing me something fragile and sacred. I took it home and hung it on the wall above my desk, where I'd see it every morning. And every time I looked at it, I thought of Marion. Not just the Marion I had met that first day with the broken water heater, but the Marion she had become since then. The one who painted, the one who walked into new rooms, the one who finally felt visible again. There was something about seeing that painting on my wall every morning that anchored me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the image to simple chairs on a porch, but everything it represented. The quiet moments, the trust built through countless small conversations. The comfort of knowing someone was waiting for you, not because they needed you to fix anything, but because your presence alone meant something. That kind of bond doesn't come around often, and certainly not by accident. I found myself starting each day with a glance at that canvas before I even poured my first cup of coffee. And most mornings, as I sipped from my chipped mug, I'd wonder what Marion was doing, if she'd started painting something new. Or if she was watching the morning light creep across her kitchen the same way I imagined she did each day. There was a rhythm to the days now, one I hadn't had in years, not since the early days of my career, when everything felt fresh and full of possibility. But now, the rhythm came not from ambition or urgency, but from something slower, something rooted in connection and quiet appreciation. One afternoon, Marion called Manat to ask for a repair, but simply to say she'd made a new kind of soup and had far too much to eat alone. Her voice over the phone sounded lighter, unguarded, and I said yes before she even finished the invitation. When I arrived, the house smelled of garlic and roasted tomatoes, and she greeted me in a soft linen apron, with a spoon in one hand and the other brushing flour from her cheek. The kitchen was a warm mess pot bubbling, counters dusted with breadcrumbs, a half-sliced loaf of sourdough resting beside a butter dish. She looked at me sheepishly, saying she might have gotten carried away. I told her it was perfect, and I meant it. We ate by candlelight, though it was still light outside, and she laughed when I pointed out her unintentional romantic ambience. She rolled her eyes, but I could see the way her smile lingered. The soup was delicious, but it was the ease between us that made the evening memorable. We lingered at the table long after the food was gone, sipping wine and listening to a soft playlist she'd made filled with piano and old folk songs. It felt like we were creating a space entirely our own, one that didn't need explaining or labeling. As the night deepened, she grew quiet. I asked if everything was all right, and she nodded, then looked at me with a softness I hadn't quite seen before. She said she'd been thinking about how much things had changed in the last few months, how she used to dread the silence of her home, and now found herself looking forward to the stillness because it meant she could sit with her thoughts and feel at peace rather than haunted. I didn't speak, just listened. And she went on to say that the biggest change hadn't come from her classes or her hobbies, but from letting someone in again. She told me she'd forgotten what it felt like to be cared for in the small ways too. Have someone notice when she seemed tired, to ask about her day with genuine interest, to laugh with her over things that once only made her feel alone. Then she said something that stopped me cold, something so vulnerable that it made the air feel heavier in the best kind of way. She said, "I used to think love was for the young, but now I think maybe it's just for the open." And then she looked away, almost embarrassed at her own honesty. I reached for her hand and held it gently, not as a grand gesture, but simply because it felt right. She didn't pull away. We stayed like that for a long moment, no more words exchanged, and in that silence, something settled between us. Mutual understanding, an unspoken recognition of the depth we had reached together. There was no need to define it, no rush to label what we were. It was enough to know that this bond, whatever it was becoming, was real and rooted in truth. When I left that night, I didn't look back to see if she was watching from the porch window. I didn't need to. I knew she was. I knew she'd be there the next time I came by, waiting not for a repairman, but for me. The next few weeks unfolded like chapters in a gentle novel. We kept meeting, sometimes for reasons, sometimes just because. I helped her plant a small herb garden along the side of her kitchen, and she surprised me with a set of brushes and a sketchbook, just in case I ever wanted to paint alongside her. We took a day trip to a lake a few towns over, where we sat by the water and shared sandwiches while watching the ripples catch the light. We began exchanging books, taking turns recommending ones that had meant something to us. One afternoon, she gave me a dog-eared copy of a novel about second chances, with a handwritten note tucked inside the cover that simply read, "Thought of you." I read it in 2 days and returned it with my own note, just one line, so maybe it's never too late. Eventually, our closeness began to draw attention. Her neighbor, the older gentleman next door, who always trimmed his hedges with military precision, started giving me longer glances. Once, as I helped Mary and carry groceries inside, he waved me over and asked if I was the new boyfriend. I laughed it off, but the question lingered. Wasn't that we were hiding anything, we just hadn't defined anything. Later that day, I told Marian what he said, and she chuckled, saying, "Small towns, you know. People will always find something to talk about." Then she looked at me more seriously and added, "But maybe he's not wrong." That was the first time either of us had acknowledged that something deeper had taken root. It didn't change anything immediately, but it gave us a new awareness, a shared sense that this wasn't just friendship with a little more light. It was becoming something neither of us had expected, but both of us were quietly hoping for. There was no sudden moment where things became romantic, no dramatic kiss in the rain or confession under the stars. It was slower than that, gentler. One night, as we were cleaning up after dinner, she brushed past me in the narrow kitchen, and we simply stopped, standing close, our hands still wet from the dishes. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I let myself fully see her, not just the beauty of her features, but the strength in her presence, the history in her eyes, the undeniable pull I'd felt from the moment she asked me that first question. "Do you think I'm still beautiful at 53? I remembered her words as if she had just said them, and without hesitation, I whispered the answer I should have given her then. "Yes, absolutely." She didn't say anything. Her eyes closed for a brief second, and then she leaned forward just enough for our foreheads to touch, a soft, reverent gesture that said everything. It wasn't fireworks or sudden passionate, it was something deeper, older, steadier. A moment that didn't require validation, only presence. That night, as I walked home under the glow of the street lamps, I realized I hadn't just found someone to care for. I'd found someone who made me want to be better, not for her, not to impress or win her over, but because being near her reminded me of who I'd always wanted to become. And somehow, despite everything, we were becoming those people together. The days began to blend into one another, not in a dull or repetitive way, but in that peaceful kind of rhythm you only find when life slows down and finds its footing in the ordinary. Marian and I had settled into something that wasn't quite defined by the usual markers. We weren't a couple in the traditional sense. There had been no declarations, no labels, no assumptions, but what we were held more weight than any label could manage. There was a tenderness to it, something built not on impulsive passion, but on showing up day after day in the quietest and most consistent ways. She'd started painting more frequently now, and sometimes I'd arrive to find her in the middle of a canvas, hair pinned loosely, brush in hand, and sunlight casting golden streaks across the hardwood floor. I never interrupted. I'd just set down whatever small tool I had brought that day and watch from the doorway for a few moments, amazed at how natural she looked when she was in her element. She didn't always notice me at first, but when she did, her smile always carried the same warmth, the kind that made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. It wasn't all soft moments and quiet bliss, though. There were shadows, 2 memories that crept in on overcast mornings, or silence that stretched a little longer than usual when something on the radio reminded her of a different time. One morning, she called me early, her voice steadier than I expected given the hour. She asked if I could come by. When I got there, she was sitting on the porch swing, holding a small photo album I hadn't seen before. Just patted the spot next to her. I sat down, and she opened the book without ceremony, flipping through the pages slowly. Old photos of her children when they were small, her late husband with his arms slung casually around her shoulders, vacations, at the beach, Christmas mornings in matching pajamas. Her fingers lingered on each image with a tenderness I couldn't touch. She finally said she hadn't opened the album in over a year, not since her youngest moved out. She wasn't crying, but there was a heaviness in her tone that made me understand that this wasn't just a trip down memory lane. It was a quiet mourning, a confrontation with how much life had changed. I listened as she spoke about how she missed those days, not because they were perfect, but because they were full. The noise, the chaos, the relentless pace of being needed all the time. Now the silence in her home echoed in ways she hadn't expected. I didn't try to fill the silence. I didn't try to fix it. I just stayed there beside her, letting her share what she needed to. Later that day, she confessed something else. She said that for a long time she had felt like her worth was tied to what she could do for others. When the house was full, when meals were cooked, when schedules were managed, she had felt valuable. But now that the demands had stopped, she found herself wondering who she was outside of being a mother, a wife, a caretaker. It was the kind of honesty that made me respect her even more, because it came from a place of real vulnerability. I told her that what she offered now wasn't measured by how many people she took care of, but by how deeply she allowed herself to be known, and that, in all the time I'd spent with her, I had never once doubted her worth. She looked at me, then, and I could see something shift in her eyes. Not relief exactly, but a softening, like a weight had been acknowledged and set down, even if just for the moment. We spent that evening making dinner together. She had found an old recipe card in her drawer, written in her mother's handwriting, and decided we'd give it a try. It was for a kind of rustic meat pie that neither of us had eaten before, but she was determined to follow it to the letter. We chopped vegetables side by side, flour on our hands, laughter filling the small kitchen as we realized we'd forgotten to preheat the oven. It felt like a scene from a simpler time, not staged or curated, but lived. After dinner, she asked if I wanted to hear something she had written. I didn't know she had been writing again. She pulled out a small notebook from the drawer by the phone and began to read aloud. It was a poem not overly polished or poetic in the traditional sense, but rich with emotion. It spoke about finding beauty in the ordinary, about remembering, how to see herself through new eyes, about rediscovery and forgiveness. When she finished, she looked up at me like she was bracing for judgment. I told her it was honest and beautiful, and I meant every word. She smiled in that way she did when trying to hide how much something mattered, and I didn't press it. But I knew what it took for her to share that. I knew it meant she trusted me. As we cleaned up the kitchen, she asked me a question. Hadn't expected. You think people can fall in love twice in a lifetime? I paused, not because I didn't know my answer, but because I knew the weight behind the question. I told her I thought love never really leaves us, even when the people do. That it changes shape, grows quieter maybe, but it never disappears. And that yes, I believed we could fall in love again, perhaps even deeper the second time, because we've learned what truly matters. She didn't say anything, but her hand brushed mine as we reached for the same plate, and the touch lingered just a little longer than necessary. That night, I went home thinking about how love wasn't always grand or cinematic. Sometimes it was slow, steady, and rooted in understanding. It was in shared meals and porch swing silences, in the quiet bravery of someone choosing to be known. And as I looked at the painting on my wall, again those two chairs facing the horizon, I realized that maybe love at this stage in life wasn't about new beginnings in the traditional sense, but about rediscovering old truths with someone who finally saw you for all that you were. A few mornings later, I was in the middle of fixing a leaky faucet at another job site when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I wiped my hands on a rag and glanced at the screen. It was Marion. She rarely called during the day, usually preferring our long, slow evenings to talk. I answered immediately, and her voice was calm, but there was something just beneath the surface, like a quiet urgency. She told me she had found something in her attic while organizing old boxes, and she didn't want to look through it alone. I told the homeowner I'd be back the next day, packed up my tools, and drove straight to her house. When I got there, she was waiting by the front door with 2 mugs of coffee, like she'd somehow known I'd drop everything. Without a word, she led me up to the attic, a space I hadn't seen before. It was dusty and warm, filled with the scent of cedar and thyme. In the center of the room sat an old wooden trunk, its brass latches dulled with age. She knelt down beside it and looked up at me, asking if I could open it with her. I nodded, kneeling beside her. And together, we lifted the lid. Inside were years of memories, old journals, faded photographs, letters folded in careful squares, and a collection of objects that each held a story. She reached for a leather-bound book first, flipping it open to a page filled with handwritten recipes and notes in the margins. "My grandmother's," she said softly, tracing her finger across the ink. There were drawings, 2 simple sketches, of teacups, flowers, birds in the margins, and the occasional scribble from a child's hand, probably her own as a girl. She smiled at those, the kind of smile people wear when they're touching a piece of their own history. As we went through the items, I could feel the emotional weight of each one. A dried bouquet from her wedding day, pressed between tissue, paper, a postcard from her honeymoon, sent to her parents, full of joy and wonder. A letter she had written to her children when they were small but had never mailed. She read that one aloud, her voice steady but thick with feeling, and when she finished, we just sat there, surrounded by the remnants of a life fully lived, quiet in the presence of something sacred. Later that afternoon, after we had carefully repacked the trunk and carried it down from the attic, we sat on the back porch with a pitcher of iced tea, letting the stillness of the day wrap around us like a soft blanket. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes closed, and said, "It's strange how you can forget parts of yourself until something pulls them back." I understood what she meant. Sometimes life moves so quickly, or becomes so focused on survival, that entire versions of ourselves get shelved, packed away like old books waiting to be opened again. I told her that rediscovering those parts was one of the bravest things a person could do. She looked at me then, really looked, and said, "You've helped me find those pieces again." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just reached over and held her hand, letting silence say the rest. We spent the rest of the week in a sort of quiet rhythm. She painted in the mornings, often outside now, using the light as her guide. I'd drop by in the afternoons with small things, extra screws for a shelf, a new hose nozzle, or just a reason to see her face. We didn't need elaborate plans or constant conversation. Sometimes we just sat on the porch and watched the wind move through the trees. Once, she showed me a painting she'd been working on in secret. It was of her backyard the way it looked in the golden hour, just before sunset, with shadows stretching long and soft across the grass. In the corner of the painting, almost hidden, were 2 figures sitting side by side. Just outlines, really, but unmistakably us. She said she hadn't meant to include them at first, just appeared. I asked if I could keep that one too, but she laughed and said not yet, that it wasn't finished. One evening, as I was heading out, she followed me to the door and said she'd been thinking about something. She hesitated, then asked if I would be willing to go with her to a small art show her class was hosting. She had submitted a few pieces anonymously and wanted someone there with her in case she lost her nerve. I said of course, and she smiled, but there was something behind her as a mix of gratitude and nervous anticipation. The show was scheduled for the following Friday evening. All week she seemed a little more restless, a little more meticulous. About her work, I caught her repainting the edges of a canvas she'd already deemed finished, adjusting the lighting in her home to see how the colors played under different conditions. She wasn't aiming for perfection, but she wanted to feel proud of what she was putting into the world. I understood that deeply. When Friday came, I picked her up just before dusk. She wore a flowing dark blue dress with soft floral prints, and her hair was tucked back in a simple clip. She looked beautiful, not just in the way that catches the eye, but in the way that makes you feel something in your chest. I told her as much, and this time she didn't shy away from the compliment. At the art center, her paintings were displayed on a clean white wall, marked only by numbers. Oh, no names. Just images and emotion. As we walked through the gallery, I watched people stop in front of her work and linger. I saw their expressions shift, soften, and once I even saw a woman wipe her eye. Marion stood beside me, watching it all, and I could feel the tension in her shoulders slowly dissolve. Someone tapped her on the shoulder. It was her instructor, who told her that one of her pieces had already sold. She looked stunned. Then she laughed, a real, uninhibited laugh that echoed through the room and made several people turn to see what was so funny. I couldn't stop smiling. When we got home that night, she set her purse down, turned to me and said, "I never thought I'd feel this alive again." It wasn't a dramatic moment, no swelling music or sweeping gestures, but it was real. As real as anything I'd ever experienced, and I knew as I stood there looking at her that whatever came next didn't need to be rushed or defined. What mattered was that we had arrived here to people with bruised pasts and quiet hopes, finding each other in the soft light of rediscovery, the morning after the gallery show. I found myself awake earlier than usual, the memory of Marion's laughter from the night before still echoing in my ears like a melody I didn't want to forget. The image of her in that dimly lit room, surrounded by strangers who were quietly moved by the art she had once been too afraid to share, left something permanent in me.
Ow.
I knew then that I wasn't just witnessing her rediscovery, I was part of it. It wasn't about fixing her or filling in the empty spaces of her life, because she had already started doing that on her own. But maybe I had become the mirror she needed to see herself fully again. It's not as someone who had passed her prime, but as someone who was still very much living it. That day I took a long walk through town. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fall, and the sidewalks were peppered with dry leaves skipping along in the breeze. I stopped at a small antique shop I'd passed 100 times and never entered. Something about the quiet energy inside reminded me of Marion's attic, and I wandered through rows of shelves, my fingers grazing the dusted wood and faded fabric, until I came across a brass picture frame with gentle floral etching along the edges. I bought it without a second thought, knowing exactly what I wanted to put inside. Later that afternoon, I printed out a photo I had taken of Marion in her garden weeks earlier, when she wasn't paying attention. Sunlight caught in her hair, and her hands dirtied from planting basil. It was an honest photo, not posed or polished, but beautiful in its authenticity. I placed it in the frame and wrapped it in brown paper, then walked a few blocks to her home. She opened the door in her usual soft cardigan and loose jeans, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. When she saw me holding the package, she tilted her head, curious. I handed it to her, unsure how to explain it, so I just said, "For your bookshelf." She unwrapped it slowly, fingers careful and deliberate, and when she saw the photo, her breath caught in her throat. She stared at it for a long moment before whispering, "I didn't know you took this." I told her that I hadn't planned to. The moment just happened, and I didn't want it to slip away. She nodded, blinking faster than usual, then reached up and hugged me without saying anything else. Her silence held more weight than any words could have. The frame found its home on her living room shelf, nestled between an old poetry collection and a glass paperweight shaped like a lily. Time I visited, I'd glance at it, and without fail, it would always bring that same warmth. One evening, a few days later, Marion surprised me by asking if I'd like to accompany her to a small retreat outside of town. A weekend art and mindfulness workshop being held at an old converted farmhouse. She said her instructor had recommended it, and though she was hesitant at first, she thought it might be exactly what she needed. I was flattered she wanted me there, and said yes without hesitation. That weekend turned out to be one of the most grounding experiences I'd had in years. The farmhouse was surrounded by tall trees and meadows that swayed in the wind like they were keeping time with something ancient and unseen. Our days were filled with slow mornings, quiet reflection, shared meals with strangers who became fast friends, and long conversations under the stars. Marion painted at sunrise one morning, wrapped in a wool shawl, her breath visible in the cool air. Watched her from a distance, sitting on a bench with a warm cup of tea, and marveled at the quiet determination in her movements. She belonged in that space, in that moment, in a way that felt almost sacred. One of the evenings, we sat by the outdoor fire pit with the others, and someone asked us to share what had brought us there. Marion hesitated, then cleared her throat and said, "I think I just needed to remember who I was before I started making." excuses for why I couldn't be that person anymore. Her words settled over the group like mist, and for a moment, no one spoke. I reached for her hand beside me and gave it a quiet squeeze. She looked at me, her eyes glistening in the firelight, and smiled, not the guarded smile she used to wear, but something softer, more certain. That night, as we sat in silence in our shared cabin, listening to the wind against the windows, she whispered, "I didn't expect any of this." I turned toward her, lying just inches away in the dim light, and replied, "Neither did I. But I wouldn't trade it for anything." She reached over and gently traced her fingers along the edge of my hand, not saying a word. That touch said enough. When we returned from the retreat, things felt even more natural between us, like we'd crossed an invisible threshold. We were still living separately, still keeping our own rhythms, but there was now a shared current. Running between our lives, stopped by in the mornings with pastries from the corner bakery. She'd leave little watercolor postcards in my mailbox with notes on the back. Things like, "This sky made me think of your voice," or "The colors here feel like Sunday morning with you." They were small, quiet gestures, but they stitched us together in ways that grander acts never could. She once told me that falling in love after 50 wasn't like falling at all. It was more like growing roots into someone else's life. I wrote that down in a notebook I kept by my bed, not because I thought I'd forget, but because some things deserve to be written down. Autumn was starting to settle fully into the town by the time Marian invited me over for what she called her annual soup night. She said it was something she used to do when the kids were still at home, pull out all the mismatched bowls, simmer a massive pot of vegetable soup all day, and open the door to anyone who needed warmth or conversation. She hadn't hosted it in a few years, not since the house became quiet and her motivation dimmed with the stillness. But something this year had stirred that old habit back into life. And when she told me about it, her eyes lit up with that familiar flicker of anticipation. I arrived early to help. The scent of onions and garlic met me at the door. She was already in the kitchen, apron tied around her waist, hair loosely pinned back, humming some tune I didn't recognize. Psst. It felt like walking into a memory I hadn't lived, but somehow knew by heart. I chopped, stirred, tasted, adjusted seasoning, and laughed when I got a little too generous with the pepper. She told me that the soup never turned out the same twice, but that was part of its magic. "It tastes like whatever the year gave you," she said. "Some years, it's a little spicier. Other times it's softer." As the afternoon faded into early evening, neighbors began to arrive. Some were people I recognized in passing faces from the local cafe or library. Others were clearly longtime friends. Marian greeted each guest with genuine affection, offering ladles of soup and slices of crusty bread. The house, once quiet and reflective, transformed into a warm gathering place filled with stories and laughter and that low, comforting hum of human connection. I found myself in the corner of the living room with an older man who claimed he once ran the town's only record store, and who insisted vinyl was the only way to truly hear music. 8. Nearby, a pair of women chatted animatedly about their garden clubs, while Marian's friend Iris played softly on the old upright piano in the hallway. Through it all, Marian moved with quiet grace, tending to everyone, making them feel seen, remembered. And every so often, her eyes would find mine across the room, and we'd share a glance that felt like a secret tucked between us. Later that night, after the last guests had gone and the house returned to silence, Marian and I sat on the floor with 2 remaining bowls of soup, backs against the kitchen cabinets. Her bare feet brushed against mine under the table, not intentionally, but not exactly accidentally either. She sighed in that way she did when her heart was full, then said, "I used to think I'd never feel this house full again." Looked around at the dim, lived-in beauty of the room, the bowls stacked in the sink, the napkins folded haphazardly, the last candle flickering on the windowsill. "It never stopped being a home," I told her. "It was just waiting for you to remember." She didn't respond, just leaned her head gently against my shoulder, and we stayed like that for a long time, letting the quiet settle around us like a soft blanket. The following week brought with it a stretch of gray skies and occasional drizzle. Marian said she didn't mind the rain. It gave her an excuse to stay in and paint. One afternoon I dropped by unannounced, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the bakery and a small brown bag with 2 apple fritters. She opened the door barefoot, wearing a long cardigan and that look of amused surprise she always got when I showed up early. "You spoil me," she teased, but I could see in her expression that the gesture landed deeper than she let on. We sat by her front window as the rain tapped steadily on the glass, sipping slowly, watching drops trace paths down the pane. She reached for a book on the nearby shelf, a collection of Mary Oliver poems, and read aloud a piece about trees bending in the wind, about strength that looked like softness. Her voice was calm even, but the way she lingered on certain lines told me she felt them as much as she spoke them. We spent the rest of that day together, not doing anything particularly remarkable. She painted while I repaired the cabinet door. That had been sticking for months. We paused for lunch, sat in companionable silence, and even took a nap on opposite ends of the couch as the sound of the rain lulled us into stillness. And in that quiet, in the shared ordinariness of it all, I realized that these moments were what I had been searching for. Not grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but presence, consistency. The kind of love that lived in the quiet corners, in the coffee refills, in the offered blanket during a movie we'd both seen 3 times already. I hadn't grown up imagining love would look like this. Now I couldn't imagine it any other way. That night, as I was getting ready to leave, Marion walked me to the door like she always did. But instead of stopping at the threshold, she stepped outside with me onto the porch, barefoot despite the damp. She looked out into the darkness, then turned to me and asked softly, "Do you ever think about what comes next?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I had so many. All the time, I finally said. But lately, I'm trying to be more present with what's now. She nodded, eyes distant, then stepped a little closer, enough that I could smell the lavender from her shampoo. "Well," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "if what's next looks anything like this, I think I'd be okay." I reached out then, brushing a raindrop from her cheek, though maybe it wasn't rain at all, and I felt the world narrow to just that porch, just that woman, just that moment. The next few days passed with a kind of quiet contentment that felt almost sacred. Marion and I had settled into a rhythm, unspoken but understood, the way the sea knows when to kiss the shore and when to retreat. There was a steadiness to our connection now, something that didn't need labeling or defining, just nurturing. I continued to take jobs around town, smaller ones now, deliberately paced so I could return to her place by late afternoon. Sometimes we cooked together, sometimes we just shared takeout on the couch, watching old films with the kind of casual ease that only came from genuine comfort. Mine one particular evening, we were halfway through a black and white drama she had. Loved in her 20s, when the power flickered and went out entirely. At first, we just sat there in the sudden dark, blinking, unsure. Then she laughed a rich, amused laugh that cut through the silence and went to fetch some candles from the hall closet. Within minutes, the living room was glowing with warm, dancing light, the flicker painting shadows on the walls and giving everything a dreamlike softness. We didn't return to the movie. Instead, we sat on the floor, backs against the couch, talking for hours. She shared more about her childhood, the strict but loving mother who raised her, the first boy who broke her heart, the years when she tried so hard to fit into roles others expected her to play. I told her about the job I turned down when I was younger because I was scared to leave town. About the night my father passed and how I never quite cried enough. About the year I forgot how to be curious. Those kinds of confessions didn't come out of obligation. They were born from the safety we had slowly built, brick by careful brick. Eventually, the topic turned to her kids, and her smile softened into something nostalgic and heavy. She talked about how hard it had been to let them grow up and make their own choices, even when those choices led to pain. How motherhood had taught her that love wasn't about holding on, but about letting go with grace. I listened, nodding, not trying to fix or comment, just receiving. That night, before I left, she walked me to the door again. But this time, she stood there longer, like she wasn't quite ready to say goodbye. I lingered too, and in that quiet, we simply looked at each other for a while. There was nothing to rush, The moment was full, and neither of us needed to speak to know what we were both thinking. The next morning brought a change in energy. I received a call from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. He was passing through town, and we agreed to grab coffee. I sat by the window of a small cafe, catching up on everything. We had missed his divorce, my work, the strange way time folded and expanded as we got older. Eventually, the conversation turned to Marion. I didn't mean to bring her up, but her name surfaced naturally like breath. My friend raised an eyebrow when I spoke about her, not in judgment but in curiosity. She sounds like someone who changed things for you, he said. I paused, then nodded. She did. Or maybe she helped me change myself. He smiled and said something about how the right people always showed up when we were ready, not when we were searching. That stuck with me long after the check was paid. That evening, I brought Marion a bouquet, not roses or anything too obvious, just a collection of late-season wildflowers I'd picked up from a roadside stand. She was in her garden when I arrived, pruning her rosemary, the air filled with the scent of earth and pine. When I handed her the bouquet, she looked surprised, touched in that way people are when they're given something simple and thoughtful. She didn't say much, just placed the flowers in a jar of water and set them on the windowsill in her kitchen. Then she turned to me and said, "Come see something." She led me into her studio, a space I hadn't entered in a while, and there on the easel was a canvas still wet with paint. It was an impressionistic view of the two of us sitting on her porch in the rain, our forms blurry and glowing as if seen through a memory. "It's not finished," she said, a little shy, "but I wanted you to see it." I stood there in silence for a long time, heart full, unsure how to express what it meant. So I did the only thing that felt right. I reached out, took her hand, and kissed it gently. She didn't pull away. The days that followed continued in a gentle blur, each one wrapped in a kind of quiet magic. We hosted a small dinner for some of her art friends. I helped her reorganize the attic one afternoon, and we found more sketches from years past, some of which she barely remembered creating. She began selling a few of her paintings at the local coop, and each time one sold, she'd call me with a mix of pride and disbelief. It was beautiful to witness someone reclaiming parts of themselves they thought were lost. And through it all, I felt like I was becoming more whole, to not because she completed me, but because being around her reminded me how to value stillness, how to listen better, how to be present. One night, just as we were getting ready to part ways for the evening, she paused at the threshold and said, "You know, I've always believed beauty changes with age, but lately, I think it deepens." I looked at her, standing there bathed in the soft hallway light, and replied, "You're the proof of that." She blushed, shook her head slightly, then smiled in that quiet, knowing way she had. We didn't say much else after that. Some moments are too full for more words. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Marion surprised me with an invitation I didn't see coming. She asked if I wanted to go with her to the nearby lake where she used to take her children when they were younger. It wasn't far, just a short drive up the winding roads past the outskirts of town. Tucked between a grove of old pines and a sloping hill that caught the sunrise just right. She said she hadn't been there in years, and something in her voice told me this wasn't just about a stroll by the water. It was about returning to a place that held pieces of her she hadn't visited in a long time. So I packed a light lunch, and she brought a blanket. And we headed out in her car, the windows cracked open and the autumn air filling the cabin with the smell of leaves and wood smoke. As we drove, she shared little bits of memory tied to the place, how her daughter used to chase frogs along the shore. Her son once tried to build a raft from old branches and nearly floated out farther than he should have. Her voice softened as she spoke, not sad, but reverent, like someone opening a well-loved book again after many years. When we arrived, the lake was almost empty, save for a pair of joggers and a man fishing quietly by the rocks. The surface of the water shimmered with the low morning sun, and the trees stood tall like old sentinels watching over the stillness. Marion led the way down a narrow path, toward a clearing she remembered, and when we got there, she spread the blanket with a graceful sweep and sat down, folding her legs beneath her. I joined her, the quiet around us wrapping us in something sacred. For a while we didn't talk. We just sat there, watching the light dance across the water and the occasional bird cut across the sky. Eventually she turned to me and said, almost as if thinking aloud, I used to bring them here to teach them how to be still. I think I forgot how to do that myself. I didn't respond with words. I just reached for her hand and held it, letting the silence carry the weight of her reflection. After lunch, we walked along the edge of the lake. She picked up smooth stones and skipped a few across the water, laughing like a girl when one managed to bounce 4 times. She told me about a story she used to tell her kids about a lake spirit who could only be seen in reflections, and how the spirit changed its shape depending on who looked into the water. I always said it was to teach them empathy, she added, tossing another stone. But maybe I was just teaching myself how to see others better. I found myself smiling at that. Marian had a way of wrapping wisdom in simplicity, of making even old myths feel personal. As the sun began to lower and the sky warmed with the golden edge of late afternoon, we sat on the blanket again, our backs resting against a tree. She leaned her head on my shoulder and I wrapped an arm around her with an ease that no longer felt like a new thing. It was then she said something that caught me off guard, not because it was surprising, but because it felt so raw. Do you think I'm still beautiful? Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper lost in the rustle of leaves. I looked at her, truly looked at the lines carved by time around her eyes, the silver strands woven through her hair, the grace that years had gifted her. And I answered with a certainty that didn't waver. Yes, more than ever. She closed her eyes and exhaled deeply, like something she'd been holding inside finally let go. We stayed at the lake until the sky faded to a soft indigo. On the way home, she kept one hand on the gear shift and the other loosely holding mine. Across the console, neither of us spoke much, but there was a current between us, warm and strong, like something had shifted. Back at her house, before I left, she stopped me on the porch and pressed her lips to mine, soft and slow, the kind of kiss that doesn't rush, doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but lingers and deepens like a promise made quietly under the stars. When she pulled back, she simply said, "Thank you for seeing me." I whispered, "Always," and walked away with my heart beating a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, I woke up feeling different. Not nervous, not unsure, just grounded. Now that whatever was growing between Marian and me wasn't temporary or circumstantial, it had roots, real ones, buried in shared time and gentle truths. Later that day, I stopped by her place with no particular reason. I found her in the back garden, hands dirty, hair tied up, humming as she repotted a small rosemary bush. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. No words were exchanged. I just grabbed a nearby trowel and joined her, side by side in the dirt. Under a sun that filtered through the trees in golden threads, we worked quietly, like two people who had found in each other something steady, something lasting, something real. The following week passed like the slow turning of pages in a well-worn book. Every day with Marian felt like another chapter that didn't need a climax to feel meaningful. We had settled into a rhythm that was both unspoken and unmistakable. There were no grand declarations, no pressing need to define what we were to each other, yet the closeness we shared deepened with every small moment we spent together. One afternoon, as the light filtered through her living room window in delicate slants, we sat sipping coffee while sorting through old photographs that Marian had finally decided to take down from the attic. Some were faded and curled at the edges. Snapshots of her children with missing teeth and muddy shoes, of family camping trips and birthday parties under balloon-filled porches. The outlines as if remembering more through touch than sight. I watched her face change with every photo, sometimes a smile, sometimes a pause, sometimes a small exhale that carried more than words ever could. When she came across a picture of herself in her 30s, laughing with wild curls and arms around her friends, she held it up to me and said, "Would you have fallen for this version of me?" I looked at it for a long time, then back at her, and replied, "I would have liked her, but I would have waited for this you." She didn't speak after that, just nodded and tucked the photo back in the box. The quiet that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of everything we didn't need to say. That night, she cooked dinner, something she rarely did unless inspired. It was a creamy mushroom pasta with fresh thyme from her garden, served in 2 slightly chipped bowls that she insisted had character. We ate on the couch with our knees brushing and her favorite playlist humming softly in the background. She talked about the possibility of signing up for an art exhibit in the spring. A local one, small but meaningful. I encouraged her without hesitation, not just because I believed in her talent, but because I knew how much courage it took for her to share what she once hid. After dinner, we didn't clean up right away. We just let the dishes sit in the sink and laid back on the couch, her head on my chest, my fingers tracing lazy circles on her arm as the music played on. In that moment, I realized that home wasn't a place or a time in life, it was a feeling, and it had found me right there in her presence. That weekend, Marion suggested a trip to the flea market. It was a quirky little place on the edge of town, full of mismatched furniture, antique lamps, old books, and handmade jewelry. She said it had been years since she'd wandered through those aisles, and something about the simplicity of the idea charmed me. We arrived just as the vendors were setting up, the air still carrying the scent of dew and early coffee. Marion drifted from booth to booth, occasionally stopping to inspect a trinket or hold up a scarf to her neck with mock seriousness. I followed, a few paces behind, watching her with quiet admiration. She had a way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary, of noticing beauty in things most people passed by. At one booth, she found a stack of vintage postcards from the 1960s and started flipping through them, reading the notes scribbled on the backs aloud. Some were romantic, some were mundane, some were downright hilarious. One simply said, "The fish here are terrible, but the weather's nice." She laughed and turned to me with a mischievous glint in her eye, saying, "Promise me we'll send silly postcards when we're old." I promised, and she bought 3. We left the market with a small bag of treasures, an old French cookbook, a ceramic cat for her kitchen shelf, and a pressed flower pendant, she insisted, looked like something from a storybook. On the way back to her house, we took a detour down a road neither of us had driven before, just to see where it led. It wound through quiet hills and pockets of trees, turning gold and red with the season. We ended up at a small overlook with a view of the valley below. She parked the car and we got out, leaning on the railing as the wind tousled her hair. "I used to be afraid of getting older," she said after a long pause. "But lately I've started to think it's not about losing youth. It's about gaining clarity." I looked at her, silhouetted against the horizon, and thought she looked more radiant in that moment than any younger version of her could have ever been. That evening, as we put away the market finds, Marion handed me one of the postcards and a pen. "Write something," she said. "Anything." I hesitated, then scribbled, "Today we got lost on purpose. It felt like we found something we weren't even looking for." She read it and smiled. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. She tucked the postcard into a drawer, saying she'd mail it to me one day just to keep me guessing. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the world turned soft again, I realized that even in our stillest days, something was always unfolding between us. There was always another layer of meaning, another quiet discovery waiting just beneath the surface of ordinary life. The chill of late autumn had begun to creep into the mornings, leaving a thin frost on Marion's windows and giving the air that crisp, clean scent of endings and beginnings all at once. I arrived at her house earlier than usual one Saturday, with a thermos of hot tea in one hand and a wool scarf in the other, knowing she'd likely forgotten to pull one out for herself. She greeted me at the door with that drowsy smile she wore on. Slow mornings, her sweater sleeves too long, and her socks mismatched. The moment she saw the scarf, she laughed, shook her head, and let me wrap it around her neck like I'd done it 100 times before. Inside, the house felt especially cozy. She had lit a few candles, the kind that smelled like cedar wood, and vanilla and soft jazz played from the radio in the corner. We had no plans that day, no projects to finish, no errands to run, nothing to cross off a list. It was the kind of day where time didn't need to be watched, only felt. She made toast. I scrambled eggs, and we ate breakfast slowly, passing the morning in the kind of silence that came from comfort, not distance. After breakfast, she surprised me by asking if I wanted to see something she hadn't shown anyone in years. Gate. I followed her up to the attic, a narrow staircase with creaky steps and the scent of old wood and linen at the far end. Behind a stack of old suitcases was a trunk she hadn't touched in over a decade. It was filled with her oldest artwork, charcoal sketches, watercolors, incomplete oil paintings, and scraps of paper with half-formed ideas. She lifted each piece with care, offering stories with some and letting others speak for themselves. One canvas stopped her. It was a portrait and finished of a younger version of herself, half-painted, the brush strokes bold and tentative at once. I started this when I turned 30, she said quietly. I was trying to paint how I felt about myself, not how I looked. But I never finished it. I think I was afraid of what I'd see. I took the painting in my hands, studying the way her eyes had been captured, not fully detailed, but alive with something searching. I looked back at her and said, "Maybe you were still becoming." She smiled softly, that wistful kind of smile that lives in the space between regret and acceptance. Later that day, we took a walk through the nearby park. The trees had mostly shed their leaves, creating a golden-brown carpet beneath our feet. Children were playing in the distance, and the wind rustled through the branches like a song half-remembered. We sat on a bench near the duck pond, watching as the water rippled from the wind. She leaned into me, our shoulders touching, and after a while said, "I used to sit here with my mother. She was the one who told me that time doesn't change us as much as it reveals us." I turned to her, noticing the way the light caught in her hair, and whispered, "Then I'm glad time brought me here." She squeezed my hand in response, and for a long while we just stayed there, two people shaped by different storms, finding warmth in the calm that followed. That evening, as the light faded and the air turned colder, we built a fire in her living room. The flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, and we pulled the blanket over our legs as we sat on the floor with mugs of cocoa, kind with cinnamon and a little too much whipped cream. She asked if I wanted to hear her read again. I nodded. She chose a worn book of poetry, and as she read, her voice low and steady, something in me settled even deeper. There was something transformative about the way she read, just the words, but the emotion behind them, as if she were wrapping each line around us like a second blanket. At one point, she paused and looked at me. "You know, I think I finally believe it when people say, love can be quiet. For a long time, I thought love had to be loud, passionate, messy, chaotic. But this is different." I nodded, understanding completely. "It's like breathing," I said. "You don't notice it until it's the thing that keeps you going." That night, as I was getting ready to leave, she walked me to the door like always. But before I could open it, she stopped me. Her fingers brushed mine, and she looked up at me with a kind of vulnerable strength that only came from someone who had rebuilt herself, piece by piece. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded. "Do you think it's too late to let someone love me completely?" Her voice cracked just slightly, like the question had lived in her too long. I stepped closer, took both of her hands in mine, and answered without hesitation, not if they'd been waiting to do it all along. She didn't cry, but her eyes shimmered, and then she pulled me into a hug that said more than any sentence could. It wasn't desperation or fear, it was trust. The kind that comes after you've learned to live with your own silence and are finally ready to let someone else echo through it. As I walked to my truck, I glanced back. She was still standing at the door, wrapped in her scarf, a soft smile playing at her lips. And in that moment, beneath the pale wash of moonlight and the hush of the sleeping neighborhood, I knew something had changed again, not dramatically, but deeply. We weren't just sharing moments anymore. We were building something real, something lasting. Something neither of us had dared to hope for, but now couldn't imagine being without. The days began to shorten, more noticeably as winter crept in. And the early evening skies turned to soft violet long before dinner. Marion's house seemed to glow more during these darker hours, always warm with candlelight or a low fire, and a calm presence that pulled me in like gravity. I found myself there more often without realizing it, showing up with no plan, no task, just a quiet need to be near her. She never questioned it, never asked for explanations. She just welcomed me in, handed me a cup of tea or the corner of a blanket, and let me be. We didn't talk about what we were or where things were going, but the way she placed her hand on my knee during movies, or the way she always made sure to leave the porch light on, said more than any definition could. It felt like we had skipped past the phase of uncertainty and landed somewhere deeper, safer, more honest. One evening, as I helped her hang a string of lights on the back porch for no reason other than the joy of it, she told me that she'd started painting again. Not just sketching or playing around with color, but actually working on a full canvas with intention. I could see the spark in her eyes as she described it, a large piece, full of light and shadow, about transformation and stillness. It doesn't have a subject yet, she admitted, but I think I'm painting what it feels like to be seen. That line stayed with me. I thought about it on my drive home that night, and again the next morning when I found myself in the hardware store picking up a new faucet she'd mentioned needing. I wasn't scheduled to help her with anything, but that didn't matter anymore. Our relationship had become this fluid exchange of time and presence, woven together by shared effort and simple kindness. When I arrived at her house with the faucet, she didn't question why I had it. She just smiled and said, "The kitchen's all yours," before slipping back into her studio with a cup of peppermint tea. I worked quietly, occasionally glancing toward the soft hum of music from her open studio door, feeling more at home than I'd felt anywhere in years. When I finished, I found her in front of the canvas, brush in hand, a streak of ochre paint on her cheek, and her eyes locked in focus. I didn't interrupt, just watched, quietly absorbing the image of her completely immersed in what she loved. Later, she showed me the beginnings of the piece. It was abstract swirls of warm tones, streaks of dusk blue and muted crimson, a canvas alive with movement. I didn't need to understand every detail to feel what it meant. "It's not done," she said, "but it's the first time I've painted something that doesn't scare me halfway through." I told her it was beautiful, and she nodded, not in modesty, but in agreement, because she had finally started believing in her own voice again. That night, we cooked dinner together, grilled cheese and tomato soup, nothing fancy, but we made it like it mattered. And as we sat at the table, eating and talking about nothing in particular, she looked up and said, "You know, I keep expecting this to fall apart. Not because of anything you've done, just because, well, life has taught me to wait for the catch." I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine, and said, "Maybe this time there isn't one. Maybe we just let this be real." Snowed the next morning, the first dusting of the season. I woke up to a quiet world blanketed in white, and immediately thought of Marion. I grabbed my coat, filled a thermos with coffee, and drove through the sleepy town toward her place. She was already outside, bundled in her long coat and boots, brushing snow off the steps. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and she looked at me with that familiar spark. "You're up early," she said. I handed her the coffee. "Snow like this deserves to be seen," I replied. "Duh." We took a walk through the neighborhood, everything muffled and serene. The trees looked like they were holding their breath. We talked about Christmas traditions, her favorite holiday cookies, the year her son built a snowman taller than the garage. And then she asked, "What about you? What do your holidays usually look like?" I hesitated, thinking about the empty house I returned to most years, the quiet dinners, the texts from friends. "They're usually simple," I said. She tilted her head. "And maybe this year they don't have to be." That suggestion led to a whirlwind of preparation over the next week. We decorated her house with strings of lights and paper, snowflakes, made a playlist of carols, baked cookies that burned on the first attempt and came out perfect the second time. She invited her daughter and son to dinner, unsure if they'd come, and to her surprise, both said yes. On Christmas Eve, I stood beside her at the front window, watching as her daughter's car pulled into the driveway. Marion squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens tonight, thank you for being here." I looked at her, that glow of nerves and joy on her face, and said, "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." The warmth inside the house stood in stark contrast to the snow-covered stillness outside. Marion moved with both excitement and quiet apprehension as she straightened the candles on the table and adjusted the centerpiece for the third time. I watched her from the kitchen doorway, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the edges of a linen napkin, a small, nervous smile touching her lips. Her daughter Eliza and her son Nolan had just arrived, shaking snow from their coats and stamping their boots by the door. I recognized the hesitation in their expressions, the cautious steps of people re-entering a space they hadn't occupied in far too long. Marion greeted them with a warmth that wasn't forced, but still laced with vulnerability. Eliza hugged her first, a bit stiff at first, but longer than Marion probably expected. Nolan followed with a quiet "Hey, Mom," and a hug that said more than his words. They noticed me standing off to the side, and Marion, with grace, introduced me simply as a good friend who's been here through a lot lately. I nodded and offered a handshake. Eliza was curious, Nolan observant, but neither looked alarmed or cold. That was a good start. Dinner unfolded like a slow, tentative dance. The conversation began with neutral topics: the weather, traffic, Eliza's new job, Nolan's recent move. Marion asked questions, listened closely, laughed at the appropriate moments, and gently nudged the dialogue when it stalled. I mostly stayed quiet, only chiming in when invited. I could sense how much this night meant to her. She had worked not just on the meal and the decorations, but on herself, trying to make room in her heart for reconnection without demanding anything in return. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed a little more freely, the tension began to ease. Eliza told a funny story about her boss's holiday party, and Nolan admitted he had been watching old family videos out of nostalgia. Marion's face lit up at the mention, and for the first time that night, her laughter rang out without restraint. After Desertan overcooked apple crumble that we all pretended wasn't slightly burned, Marion brought out a small box and placed it on the table. Inside were old Christmas ornaments from when the kids were little. She passed them around like treasures, each one triggering a memory, a joke, a story half forgotten. Eliza found one she had made in kindergarten, a glitter-covered mess that Marion insisted had always held a place on the tree. Nolan pulled out a tiny felt reindeer missing an eye and laughed, remembering how their dog had once chewed off its antlers. The room filled with shared warmth, and something unspoken began to mend. It wasn't dramatic or emotional, just steady and real, like a bridge slowly being rebuilt, plank by plank. Later, after the kids had gone and Marion was in the kitchen, washing dishes, I stepped in and took the sponge from her hands. "Let me," I said, and she let out a soft sigh, leaning against the counter with a tired but content expression. "That went better than I thought," she whispered. I nodded. "They needed tonight as much as you did." She looked down, then back at me, eyes misty but calm. "You know, I spent years thinking I had failed as a mother, that I had pushed them too far, or loved them too loudly, or not enough. Maybe love isn't measured in perfection. Maybe it's just in showing up again, even after the silence." I leaned over and kissed her forehead gently, holding her hand beneath the soft hum of the kitchen lights. The snow was still falling when I left her house that night, blanketing everything in a kind of sacred stillness. I drove home feeling like something bigger than either of us had taken root. It wasn't just romance or companionship, it was witnessing someone brave enough to let go of guilt, to open their heart after years of protecting it. The next morning, she called and asked if I could help her hang the rest of the ornaments. I arrived to find the tree half decorated and Marian sitting on the floor in a tangle of lights, laughing at her own mess. We untangled the strands, sipped coffee, and placed each ornament with care. When we reached the top, she pulled out the old angel and handed it to me. "You do the honors," she said. I climbed the small step stool, placed the angel atop the tree, and stepped back. She came to stand beside me, her arms slipping naturally around my waist. "It's beautiful," she whispered. But I wasn't looking at the try. I was looking at her, and I couldn't help but whisper back, "So are you." As the day faded into early dusk, we sat on the couch watching the lights flicker. She leaned her head on my shoulder and asked, "Can we just stay in this moment for a while?" I tightened my arm around her. "We've got all the time in the world." She closed her eyes and rested there, and I realized we had both found something neither of us had been looking for when we first met. And maybe that's the kind of love that lasts, the kind that doesn't rush or shout or demand, but the kind that arrives softly, builds slowly, and stays. The days between Christmas and the New Year settled into a peaceful rhythm, almost like the universe itself had paused to catch its breath. Marian and I spent most of that time together, not in grand gestures or events, but in the quiet, simple ways that life intertwines when two people begin to feel like a single rhythm. There were slow mornings filled with soft light and shared newspapers, afternoons spent reorganizing her studio or fixing loose cabinet doors, and evenings curled up on the couch with a movie neither of us really paid attention to. Between us had become the most comfortable part, not something to be filled, but something that spoke in its own language. One night, as snow fell outside and a fire crackled in the hearth, Marian brought out her nearly finished painting. Had changed since I'd last seen it. The swirls were more pronounced, the contrast stronger, and right in the middle. Emerging from the movement and color was the shape of a woman, undefined but unmistakable, half in shadow, half in light. "I think she's me," Marian said, softly, "or who I've become." I couldn't take my eyes off it. She had painted not just transformation but self-recognition, a reclamation of identity through the most personal and vulnerable lens. I told her it was her most honest work, and she smiled with a kind of quiet pride I hadn't seen before. The next morning brought with it a soft gray sky and a call from a local gallery owner named Renee Simoy. Marian had met years ago at a community event. Marian had sent her a photo of the painting on a whim, not really expecting a response. But Renee wanted to meet, to see the piece in person. At first, Marian was hesitant. "It's not finished," she said. "I don't even know what I'd say." But I reminded her of the words she once told me, that maybe art didn't need to be perfect, just honest. After a long pause, she agreed to the meeting and set the appointment for the weekend. In the days leading up to it, she grew more focused. She worked on the painting in short, intense bursts, stepping back often, tilting her head, then adding the smallest detail with deliberate care. I watched from the doorway most times, quietly making coffee or tinkering with her broken radio while she poured her soul into brush strokes. The house had taken on a kind of charged stillness, like we were both holding our breath for something neither of us could name. When Saturday came, I wrapped the canvas carefully and loaded it into the back of my truck. Marian wore a navy coat I hadn't seen before, her hair pinned up loosely and her fingers tapping nervously on her lap. She didn't speak much during the drive, just stared out the window as fields and fences rolled past, the winter light turning everything silver. The gallery was tucked into a quiet street downtown, modest from the outside but filled with warmth and character once we stepped through the door. Renee greeted us with a wide smile and led us to a side room where artists sometimes previewed their work. Marian unwrapped the painting with careful hands, and when it stood upright on the easel, even I felt a shift in the room. Renee didn't speak for a long time. She circled the piece slowly, absorbing it the way one might absorb a confession. Then she looked at Marian and said, "This is brave." Marian blinked quickly, as if surprised by the choice of word. Renee continued, "It's not just beautiful, it's vulnerable. And that's what makes it unforgettable." They talked for a while after that about technique, about storytelling through color, about the possibility of including the piece in a winter exhibit. Marian was hesitant, but Renee assured her there was no pressure, just admiration and an open invitation. When we left the gallery, Marion was quiet again, but this time it wasn't fear I saw in her expression, it was processing. The kind of silence that follows a door being opened wider than expected. On the drive home, she finally spoke. I never thought anything I created could be seen that way. Like it matters beyond me. I reached over and took her hand. It does matter. Because you matter. And now they're just beginning to see what I've known for months. That night, we lit the fireplace again and ordered takeout from her. Favorite Thai place? We sat on the floor with the food spread out between us, laughing at the fortune cookies that said things like, "Your future is spicy and great changes are coming in your living room." As we sipped wine and leaned back against the couch, Marion turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think the best part of my life had already passed. All I had left were memories and echoes. But lately," she trailed off, eyes glinting in the candlelight, "lately it feels like the story's just beginning." I smiled and pulled her close, resting my cheek against her hair. "It is," I whispered, "and it's going to be a good one." New Year's Eve arrived, not with a bang, but with a gentle hum, the kind of quiet joy that blooms when you no longer feel the need to prove anything to anyone. Marion and I decided to stay in, avoiding the chaos of parties or late-night bars, and instead created our own kind of celebration. She pulled out an old board game from a forgotten closet shelf, and I brought over a bottle of sparkling wine I'd been saving since last spring. We cooked together, our hands brushing now and then, as we reached for the same spoon or bumped hips while moving between stove and sink, laughing at the rhythm we'd built without ever planning it. The night moved slowly, comfortably, wrapped in warmth and the kind of peace that comes when you realize you don't need to chase fireworks, when the real light is already in the room with you. At 10 minutes to midnight, she pulled me out onto the porch. The town was still, the stars hanging heavy and bright above us, the kind of sky that only winter seems to make possible. She wrapped herself in a blanket and leaned against the railing, while I stood beside her, sipping from 2 mismatched mugs of cider. And then, as the countdown began, somewhere faintly on a neighbor's television, she turned to me with eyes that held something soft and infinite. "I used to dread this night," she said. "It felt like another reminder of everything I hadn't done, everyone who was gone, and how much of the past I still carried around." She paused, her breath making clouds in the cold air. "But not this year. This year I feel lighter." I nodded, sliding my arm around her. "That's because you've let go of what wasn't yours to carry forever." She turned her face to mine and whispered, "And because you showed up." We stood like that, still and close, as the midnight hour arrived. Somewhere fireworks cracked and sparked in the distance, but we didn't need to look. The real celebration was in the way she leaned into me, in the way my hand found hers without thinking, and in the knowledge that the next chapter wasn't something we feared it, was something we were choosing to write together. The days that followed settled into a deeper kind of knowing. Marion's painting was accepted into the gallery's winter exhibit, and I watched her navigate the experience with a mix of grace and disbelief. At the opening night, dressed in a burgundy dress she hadn't worn in years, she stood by her piece like it was an old friend finally seen. People gathered around it, admiring, asking questions, offering interpretations, and I stood back, letting her take up the space she had always deserved. At one point, she looked across the room at me, her eyes shining with something far stronger than pride, something that looked a lot like a rival. Afterward, we walked through the snowy streets toward my truck, our breaths fogging in the air, our fingers linked tightly. "That was surreal," she murmured, almost to herself. I stopped, beneath a street lamp, brushing a snowflake from her cheek. "No," I said. "That was overdue." Weeks passed, the snow melted, and spring began to show its first shy signs. We spent a lot of time on her back porch, watching birds return to the trees and sipping iced tea under a sky that was slowly remembering how to be blue again. Marion had started a new canvas brighter than the last, and I was helping her replace the rotting boards on her garden fence. There were no grand declarations between us, no need for labels or timelines. What we had was something better: presence, honesty, and a shared rhythm that didn't require validation to be real. One morning, as we dug holes for tulip bulbs in the softening earth, she looked over and said, You never did answer my question properly, you know. I furrowed my brow. Which one? She smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Back when you checked my water heater? I asked if you thought I was still beautiful at 53. I sat back on my heels, wiping sweat from my forehead, and looked her in the eyes. I didn't answer then, I said slowly, because still makes it sound like beauty is something that fades, something that runs out. But you, I reached for her hand. You've only become more radiant with time, not in spite of it, but because of it. Her eyes shimmered, and she nodded, not with surprise, but with quiet acceptance. She was finally ready to believe it. Right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. Yeah, this one hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.